The fluorescent lights hummed their 3 a.m. song, that endless electronic whisper that never stopped at Sacred Heart Hospital in San Diego. Laura Bennett moved through the ICU like a ghost, present but unnoticed, efficient but unremarkable. Just a night shift nurse. Just someone who happened to fold the oxygen tubing with exact precision, each coil the same diameter as the last, the way supply protocols required. The way precision demanded. Her left leg dragged slightly as she pivoted from bed 3 to bed 4, the drag barely noticeable unless you knew what to look for. Old injury. Old story. Not her story anymore. The spine wound had healed as much as it ever would. 18 fragments of Pakistani shrapnel had embedded themselves along her L3 and L for vertebrae 7 years ago, during what the official record called a training accident at Bagram airfield. The official record was a lie, but lies kept people safe. Lies kept her employed. Lies meant no federal background checks, no classified audits, no questions about who she really was when her hands moved through a trauma assessment like muscle memory itself had a heartbeat. She checked the Philips monitor above patient bed 2, sinus rhythm, stable, oxygen saturation 94% on 2 liters nasal cannula. Her fingers moved the pulse oximeter sensor 1 mm to the left, recalibrating. The reading climbed to 96. Better. The patient slept. The night shift was quiet the way nights should be quiet, the way they almost never were when you'd spent 12 years knowing that quiet was the moment before everything exploded. Laura's hand drifted to her scrub pocket, fingers finding the small outline beneath the fabric. The dog tag. 1 tag, not 2. The chain was broken, had been broken for 3 years now, but she'd never gotten it repaired. Repairing it would mean taking it somewhere. Explaining it to someone. The chain hung in pieces against her ribs, a weight that had nothing to do with mass and everything to do with what was engraved on the metal. She tucked it deeper, letting her hand linger for just a moment against the fabric before withdrawing. The ICU at 3 in the morning smelled like antiseptic and the faint copper edge of medications, that sharp chemical perfume that meant someone nearby was fighting for their life and losing ground in millimeters per hour. She moved to the linen cart and began folding the patient blankets, each one receiving the same treatment. Fold 1, crease sharp as a knife edge. Fold 2, crease again. Military corners. The way her father had taught her before he died. The way the army had perfected it. The way it mattered because precision meant nothing left to chance, and chance was what killed people. Her shoulder caught in the overhead light. For a moment, the scar at her collarbone became visible, thin white lines like lightning branching down toward her sternum, souvenirs from a blast that should have stopped her heart. She adjusted her scrubs, pulling the neckline higher. The dog tag shifted again, the broken chain catching against the fabric, and she pressed one hand flat against her chest to hold it still. At the nurse's station, someone was watching. Laura didn't turn. She didn't need to. She'd learned 12 years ago to feel the weight of attention without seeing it, the way you could sense a sniper's scope at 1,000 meters if you trained your nervous system right. She simply continued folding, her movements economical and precise, each motion exactly as large as it needed to be and no larger. Dr. Marcus Ashford had arrived at Sacred Heart 3 months ago, brought in from the administrative track to oversee ICU operations and modernize protocols. He was the kind of doctor who wore his title like expensive cologne, the way some people wore watches that cost more than a car. His eyes were sharp, not sharp in the way of someone who'd learned to read the slope of a patient's blood pressure and know what it meant. Sharp in the way of someone who was always calculating, always assessing which pieces of the board mattered and which ones were expendable. He sat at the station now, his chin resting on his hand, watching the night shift move through their routines like he was evaluating them for a role in a play only he understood. Laura felt his gaze move across her, for quick assessment, the way you might look at a piece of hospital equipment that was functioning properly and therefore not worth your attention. A quiet nurse with a limp. Someone who kept her head down and didn't cause trouble. Someone whose certifications were clean and whose performance review said she was competent but unexceptional. Perfect. The invisible kind of perfect that meant no one asked questions. She reached down to adjust the bottom fold of a blanket, and the dog tag swung forward again, the broken chain barely catching on the edge of her scrub top. Just for an instant. just long enough that someone watching very carefully might see the glint of metal, the flash of something that didn't quite belong in the inventory of a night shift nurse. She felt it happen, felt the moment of exposure, and her hand moved without thinking, pressing the tag flat against her ribs again, holding it there with the kind of stillness that came from practice. The monitor on bed 1 beeped once. A reminder. An alarm about nothing, just a sensor that had shifted slightly. Laura moved toward it, her assessment complete in less than a second, saturation still good, heart rate steady, patient still sleeping through the night. She adjusted the sensor and the beeping stopped. The room returned to its humming silence. The clock on the wall showed 3:56 a.m. 13 minutes until shift change started filtering in, until day shift arrived with their coffee cups and their bright voices and their questions about how the night had gone. 13 minutes until she had to be someone else, someone who didn't know how to perform emergency thoracotomy with a field knife. Someone who hadn't spent 7 years learning to move through hospitals the way she'd once moved through Helmand Province, staying invisible, doing the work no one else wanted to do, saving people no one knew she was saving. Dr. Ashford stood up from the station. He was tall, the kind of tall that came from privilege and posture, and he moved through the ICU with the confidence of someone who'd never had to think about how his body occupied space. He passed her without speaking, without acknowledgement, just a man who'd observed a competent nurse doing competent work and filed it away in the category of things that required no further thought. Laura continued folding. Her hands moved like they always moved, like muscle memory itself was breathing, like precision was a language that didn't require translation. One fold, one crease. One fold, one crease. The rhythm was meditation. The rhythm was armor. The rhythm was the only thing between Major Laura Bennett and whoever was left of the woman who'd worn the uniform and held the secrets that got people killed. The radio at her hip crackled. Trauma incoming. ETA for minutes. Training accident, naval personnel, unknown vitals. Her hand moved to the dog tag without permission from her brain. Her fingers found it beneath the scrubs, and she held it there for one long breath. Navy. Training accident. The words hung in the air like they meant something personal. Like the universe had a sense of irony and no sense of mercy. She set down the blanket, folded to precise specifications. Around her, the ICU began to shift into higher gear, nurses moving faster, equipment being checked, the calm of the night giving way to the controlled chaos of incoming emergency. Laura Bennett, age 34, former major in special operations, pulled her scrubs straight and moved toward the trauma bay. The dog tag settled against her ribs again, the broken chain of weight that no one could see and everyone should have been afraid of. The trauma bay doors exploded open at 11:16 p.m., and the stretcher came through like it was arriving at its own funeral. Boots on tile. 1, 2, 3, 4. The paramedics called out vitals in that urgent staccato that meant catastrophic, Navy training accident, full submersion drill, massive internal trauma, we lost him twice en route, last pressure 70/40 and dropping. Laura was already moving before the stretcher cleared the threshold. She had pulled on her gloves in the 3 seconds it took the charge nurse to flag the incoming critical, and now she was at the patient's left side, her hands moving with the precision of someone who had done this exact sequence 10,000 times before. Check airway. Check breathing. Check perfusion. The patient's chest was a topography of bruising, massive blunt force trauma from equipment failure during a dive training exercise at Naval Base Point Loma. Her fingers found his radial pulse, all ready and thready, flickering like a candle about to die. Then she saw his face. The years hadn't changed the bone structure. Grayer now, worn down by rank and command decisions that probably kept him awake the same way certain memories kept her awake. Captain Richard Moss. Older. Broken. Bleeding internally from whatever the ocean had done to him in those dark seconds before the rescue boat reached him. 3 years since Bagram. 3 years since she had stood in a courtroom while he testified about disobeyed orders and protocol violations, while she had tried to explain that you cannot evacuate 17 soldiers trapped in a compound when the exit is covered by sniper fire from 3 angles. You cannot leave them. The court-martial had lasted 6 days. His words on the stand had lasted 6 minutes. Her career had ended in the time it took him to drink a cup of coffee after testimony. 2 seconds. That is how long she froze. Her hand stopped moving. Her breath caught. The world compressed into the narrow space between who she was supposed to be and who she actually was, and for 2 seconds that felt like 2 years, every part of her wanted to let him die. To simply step back. To let his blood pool where it was pooling. To let his heart, already weak with shock and trauma, simply stop. Then her muscle memory overpowered her history. Type and cross-match, 8 units uncross-matched ONEG stat, she called out, her voice flat and professional as if her spine had not just turned to concrete. Get me 2 large bore 4s, I need a central line tray, and someone call vascular, we're looking at probable hepatic laceration based on the trauma pattern. She was already running the rapid assessment, her fingers mapping the contours of his abdomen, feeling for the rigid distension that meant blood was filling spaces it should not be filling. The antiseptic smell of the trauma bay wrapped around her, sharp and chemical, as she moved into the hemorrhage protocol like she was slipping on a uniform she had worn her whole life. The ICU nurses gathered outside the glass walls. 8 of them. 12. The word spreads fast in a hospital when a critical arrives and the night shift charge takes the lead without waiting for attending approval. They watched her work. They watched her hands move with steady precision, never hesitating, never fumbling, working the central line with a kind of casual competence that belongs to someone who has been doing this not for 3 years but for something much longer. The fluorescent lights painted everything clinical and pale, and her shadow moved across the glass like it owned the room. 18 minutes into the resuscitation, his blood pressure climbed back to 92/58. Still dangerous. Still hanging by a thread. But climbing. Her breathing exercises had kept his oxygenation at 94%, and the uncross-matched blood was flowing in through the rapid infuser, warming him back toward normal temperature, his core temp climbing from 91.3 degrees. She had the hemorrhage managed in the way that field medics manage hemorrhage when there is no surgeon available, with knowing hands and the absolute refusal to watch someone die. That was when Dr. Ashford arrived. He came through the doors with the confidence of someone used to rooms falling quiet when he entered, the kind of presence that made the air pressure change, like an altitude shift nobody could quite identify. He was handsome the way some sharks are handsome, clean lines, cold eyes, a smile that never reached anything dangerous inside him. 54 years old, Laura had overheard, former military physician who had gone private practice and then upscale, working emergency medicine at a hospital expensive enough that the parking lot had a valet station. He moved to the opposite side of the stretcher from Laura, his eye scanning the monitors with the automatic assessment of someone trained to read them, and then his gaze dropped to her chest. The broken dog tag had slipped from beneath her scrubs during the compressions. The chain was fractured, silver had corroded and snapped months ago, holding by only the last link, and the tag itself swung free, turning in the antiseptic air. Military issue. Tarnished. Engraved with service number and branch and blood type and a single name, Bennett. But he was not looking at her name. He was looking at the classification code embossed on the back. The one that meant federal security clearance. The one that meant special operations. The one that meant certain things to certain people who had also served and who knew what those codes actually meant and why someone would still be wearing one 3 years after they had allegedly left the military behind. His eyes locked onto it for exactly 3 seconds. Then his face went neutral in that way that trained military personnel go neutral when they have just seen something that changes the entire calculation of a room. He looked at her face. Looked back at the tag. And then he nodded at the monitors and said, "I'll take it from here, Laura. Good work. You can step back." It was not a compliment. It was not a request. It was the sound of him filing information away, categorizing it, deciding what to do with it. She stepped back. Her hands left the 4 lines and the medication pushes to his hands, and she moved to the corner of the trauma bay while he took over the lead position, his movements precise and practiced, not better than hers but different, the movements of someone used to operating on his own terms, in rooms where he did not have to explain himself. The nurses who had been watching through the glass came in to assist him, and within 15 minutes he had a surgical team being paged, and Captain Moss was being moved toward the OR with a prognosis that had shifted from might not survive the night to significant chance of recovery. Laura pulled off her gloves and pressed them into the biohazard waste container with the mechanical precision of routine. The dog tag had already retreated back beneath her scrubs. She could feel it now, resting against her skin below her collarbone, the small weight of it like an anchor someone had tied around her ribs 3 years ago and she had never quite managed to remove. She moved toward the hallway to document the resuscitation in the patient chart, her hand still moving with muscle memory that belonged to somebody else, somebody she was not supposed to be anymore, somebody whose name and rank had been filed away in a discharge folder marked honorable but without explanation. The antiseptic smell of the trauma bay clung to her scrubs. Behind her, Ashford was standing in the center of the resuscitation bay, staring at the spot where she had been, and the expression on his face was not anger. It was calculation. It was the look of a man who had just solved a problem he had not been trying to solve, and who was now trying to decide if the solution was going to create more problems than it solved. But that was not the worst part. The worst part was that he had seen enough to know something. He had not seen everything. But he had seen enough. And in a hospital where accreditation reviews happened every 5 years, and where Department of Defense contracts paid for 60% of the surgical wing's operating budget, someone with his access to administration and his connections to military procurement and his 3 failing quarters of performance reviews needed desperately to stay on the right side of every single regulation. Someone carrying a security clearance she was not supposed to have was not regulation. Laura clocked out at midnight and moved through the parking lot toward her car, the night air of San Diego settling around her like a familiar uniform. The dog tag rested against her ribs. The fluorescent lights of the hospital faded behind her. And somewhere inside the building, Dr. Ashford was making a decision about what to do with what he had seen. The overhead page crackled at 0847, her voice synthetic and unavoidable, Nurse Benny to administration. Nurse Benny to administration. Not Laura. Never Laura anymore. Just the diminutive, the dismissal, the reminder that she was interchangeable. The entire floor heard it. 3 nurses at the med cart looked up. An aide paused mid-stride with a specimen tray. The name hung in the air like an accusation, and Laura kept walking, kept pretending she hadn't heard, though her hands had already stilled on the 4 lines she was checking. She took the stairs. Elevators meant witnesses, meant time to think, meant the possibility of running. The stairwell smelled like industrial cleaner and something older underneath, years of fluorescent dust settling on metal railings. 2 flights up, she found Dr. Ashford waiting on the landing, his posture casual but his eyes already holding the shape of the conversation. He wasn't in scrubs. He wore a pressed shirt, tailored, the kind that costs more than her monthly car payment. Power dressed as professionalism. "Walk with me," he said. Not a question. The supply closet was 3 doors down the hallway. Ashford moved with the fluid certainty of someone who had rehearsed this, who had chosen this location for its isolation. The door sealed behind them, fluorescent light casting everything in the color of old bone. Metal shelves lined with gauze, saline bags, boxes of gloves. A space meant for things, not conversations. The air was stale, recycled. Antiseptic underneath everything. "I've been reviewing your personnel file," Ashford began, his voice dropping into the register he used with junior residents, low, sharp, designed to make itself felt. 3 years at Sacred Heart. Impeccable technical record. Commendations for patient care. He paused. A theatrical pause. Then I saw something that shouldn't be there. Laura said nothing. Her hands hung at her sides. The dog tag felt heavier than it should, as though it had mass now, as though it was pressing down through the layers of her scrubs into her chest. "The tag around your neck," Ashford continued. "When you were managing Captain Moss, it slipped. I saw it." His jaw tightened. Not anger. Calculation. "I spent for years in the Navy before medical school. I know what those markings mean. I know what that classification code represents. She turned her head slightly, meeting his eyes. A mistake. He saw it as permission. Nurses who play soldier, he said, his voice hardening, and who possess an authorized military identification raise questions about hospital security protocols I cannot afford to have raised. Not during accreditation review. Not this year. He stepped closer. The supply closet contracted around them. Your clearance, your background, your presence on this floor, any one of those details could trigger a federal audit. I'm not willing to expose Sacred Heart to that liability because you can't let go of your old life. Laura's breathing stayed even. In through the nose. Out through the mouth. A technique she'd learned in a place she couldn't name for situations she couldn't describe. Effective immediately, Ashford said, you're reassigned to night rotation on the medical floor. Your access badge is being reconfigured. ICU, neuro, critical care wings, locked to you now. I'm also restricting your access to electronic medical records outside your assigned unit. He pulled a folded printout from his pocket, hospital letterhead, his signature already in place. This is documentation of your performance concerns. It goes in your file today. He held it out. She didn't take it. You're an excellent nurse, he continued, his voice adopting that false gentleness that made it worse. You'll do well on the medical floor. Night rotation has good people. Quiet. Safe. No one asking questions about your background. He set the paper on a shelf between boxes of sterile dressing packs. I'm going to help you move on to something better. County General has an opening in their night ICU. I have a contact there. Within 2 weeks, we can facilitate a transfer. You get a fresh start. Sacred Heart gets peace of mind. The word facilitate hung in the air like a threat disguised as an opportunity. Laura turned to face the shelves, her shoulders straight, her face blank. When she spoke, her voice carried no inflection. Yes, doctor. She walked out without taking the paper. Ashford didn't call after her. The medical floor was 3 wings away, and she moved through Sacred Heart like a ghost learning the path to its own haunting. Her badge still worked in the elevator. Still worked on the ward doors. But something had changed in the scanning mechanism, some invisible reconfiguration that locked her out of the ICU's back in trance, out of the neuro unit, out of the places where her muscle memory lived. She tested it once at the ICU stairwell entry at 1400, sliding her badge through the electronic lock. A red light. A mechanical click of refusal. Over the next 72 hours, Ashford moved her 3 times. Night shift to day shift. Day shift to swing shift. Each reassignment put her farther from Captain Moss's bedside, farther from the routine rounds that might have let her see him without drawing attention. The shifts were crafted deliberately, overlapping gaps where she'd be present but not present, working but isolated, competent but useless. By Friday, she had access to the medical floor, orthopedics, and oncology. Everything except where she needed to be. She found him in the stairwell on Monday at 1100, just as she knew she would. The stairwell had become his place to make phone calls, away from the main corridors, away from the administrative suite. His voice carried down from the 3rd floor landing, professional and crisp. Yes, I have documentation already prepared. Performance concerns, scope of practice issues. County General has the opening? Good. Yes, we can facilitate transfer by Thursday. I'll have HR expedite the paperwork. Thank you. A pause. No, she won't be a problem. I'm moving her to the night rotation with the understanding that we're helping her transition. Laura stood 2 flights below, not breathing. Not moving. Just listening to her cell being erased, systematically, with the precision of someone who had thought this through. Not just moving her away from Moss. Moving her away from the hospital entirely. Removing her before she noticed something, before she dug into something, before her security clearance and her questions became the liability he feared. She descended the stairs silently, her footsteps soundless on the concrete steps. That night, working the medical floor in the fluorescent dark of 2,300 hours, she pulled up the admission paperwork for every patient admitted to Sacred Heart in the 72 hours before Captain Moss arrived. Her badge still gave her access to records outside the ICU. Ashford hadn't thought to restrict that. She worked in the break room at a terminal in the back, screen tilted away from the hallway, and she read through the forms with the eye of someone trained to see what didn't belong. Lab results, vital signs, physician notes, nursing assessments. All of it ran like clockwork through the standard system. Except Captain Moss's paperwork didn't match the protocol. His admission timestamp was 0347. His pre-hospital care notes listed a naval facility as the injury site, standard. But his initial lab values were already in the system before his triage interview was documented. His blood type cross-matched before his consent form was signed. Small gaps. Mechanical errors, technically. The kind that happen sometimes. Unless they didn't happen by accident. She closed the terminal at 0300 and didn't open it again. For days later, at 0247, her personal phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. No caller ID. No name. Just words. Moss coding. ICU 3. Crash team delayed. She was on the medical floor, 7 floors below. Her badge wouldn't open the ICU stairwell. The elevator would take 45 seconds to arrive, ascend, arrive again, and the doors would open. Too long. She moved instead to the central stairwell and ran, taking the steps 3 at a time, her left leg screaming the protest of old shrapnel. The pain bright and sharp and useful. Pain is data, pain is information, pain tells you the body is still capable. 6 flights. Her breath came hard and even and controlled. The ICU doors opened to chaos that had already started without her. Captain Moss lay in ICU 3, his chest rising and falling in the shallow panic of cardiac tamponade, blood collecting inside the pericardium, compressing his heart, his blood pressure dropping like a stone, 70/42, then 66/40, his heart rate climbing beyond the monitor's easy comprehension. The ICU nurse was on the phone with someone, her voice high and fractured. The resident stood at the bedside, frozen, his hands held at his sides as though they didn't belong to him. The attending surgeon was in OR 2, 20 minutes away at best. The crash team was at County General, hospital-to-hospital transfer, 12 minutes at best with lights and traffic. Laura's voice came out flat and absolute, thoracotomy tray. Now. The ICU nurse moved. Years of instinct overrode her confusion about who this nurse was, why this nurse was here, why this nurse sounded like she owned the room. A resident appeared with a tray, sterile instruments, surgical drapes, the necessary architecture of emergency. The resident who had been frozen stepped back, and Laura understood without needing to be told that he knew the shape of his own incompetence, that he recognized expertise when it moved past him. The sedation was already running. A moment for it to take. Then she painted the skin with betadine, the orange spread clean and precise, and she opened the chest with the kind of certainty that comes from muscle memory spanning a decade and a half. The blade went in at the 4th intercostal space, and the rib spreader opened the chest cavity like a book, and the pericardium was right there, that membrane holding the compression, holding back the hemorrhage. She opened it and the blood came, dark, thick, weeks old in the way blood gets in a closed space, and it drained into the field, and she could see the heart, the actual heart, compressed by the weight of what was drowning it, and she reached in with her hand flat and her fingers curved exactly right, and she began to compress manually, counting in a voice that belonged to someone who had done this before in places that no longer existed. "Continue compressions," she said to the resident. She stepped back, and he stepped in, and his hands moved where hers had been, following the rhythm, following the pattern, following the thing she had shown him without words. Sinus rhythm returned first on the monitor. A spike of green, a blip of hope, then another, then a rhythm that held. The heart, manually assisted, started to beat on its own again. The surgical team arrived at 0255 in a storm of voices and movement and competence, and they took over the compressions, took over the tray, took over the body, and Laura stepped back to the wall where she was no longer needed. She watched them work for 7 seconds, and then she turned and walked out of the ICU as though she had never been there. The subacute wing felt like exile. Laura knew it by the fluorescent lights, dimmer here, spaced further apart, casting everything in a sickly amber that made wounds look worse than they were. She'd been moved twice in 3 days. First from ICU to step down, then from step down to the back corridor where the chronic patients lived out their slow declines. Ashford's handwriting on the assignment sheet was precise. Methodical. The handwriting of someone building a paper trail. She didn't complain. She folded the assignment into her pocket and walked to her first station, pushing the med cart with the kind of practiced efficiency that made the work invisible. 23 years of muscle memory. 3 tours. 2 continents. And now this, pushing pills to people whose names she would forget by morning because she was meant to forget them. That was the point. Ashford wanted her invisible. The stairwell door clicked shut behind her at 0147. She ducked away from her assigned wing to use the bathroom on the 3rd floor, a small rebellion, taking the stairs instead of walking through the main corridor where he might see her. The concrete echoed her footsteps, the kind of hollow sound that carries voices downward like a chimney. That's when she heard him. Ashford's voice filtered down from above, muffled but distinct, traveling through the stairwell shaft with the clarity of a confessional. He was on the landing between 4th and 5th, pressed into the corner, his phone to his ear. Laura stopped moving. Not hiding. Just listening. Nursing instinct, gather all available data before making a diagnosis. Yes, I've expedited the paperwork, he was saying. His voice had a texture like wet concrete, smooth on the surface, solid underneath. County General can take her starting next week. The shift differential is lower, the caseload is higher, and the staff there won't ask questions about her background. A pause. No, I haven't filed the formal transfer yet. I want her documented here as the one requesting it. Performance concerns, nothing specific enough to trigger legal review, but enough that any future employer won't touch her. Another pause. His laugh was a sound like breaking glass. She's a floor nurse. Who checks floor nurses? HR will rubber stamp it by Friday, and by Monday she'll be someone else's problem. Laura's hands were perfectly steady. This was information. Data. Pain is information. She turned on the step and walked back down the way she'd come, her footfall silent, a skill that never left you, the ability to move through a space without announcing yourself. By the time Ashford descended to the 3rd floor landing, she was gone. She had 47 minutes left in her shift. She returned to the subacute wing, checked vitals on 3 patients whose names she already didn't register, and waited. The text came at 0234. Unknown number. 3 words and a location, Moss coding, ICU 3, crash team delayed. Laura was moving before her brain had finished processing the sentence. She set the medication cart against the nurse's station, she didn't care about abandoning it, and pushed through the stairwell door with the kind of urgency that civilians never understood. Not panic. Panic was a luxury. This was response. This was someone who had made a decision and was executing it. 6 flights. Her calves burned. Her spine, the old wound, sang a low, familiar note of protest. She didn't slow down. The ICU doors burst open at her touch, and she read the room in 2 seconds, Captain Moss on the bed, chest heaving with effort that his heart wasn't producing, the monitor showing electrical activity without mechanical perfusion. Cardiac tamponade. His pericardium was filling with blood like a water balloon, the pressure strangling his heart with every beat. The resident at the bedside was frozen, both hands suspended in the air, his mouth open in the shape of a question he didn't know how to ask. Thoracotomy tray, Laura said. Not a request. A command. Size 10 blade. Retractors. Satin sky clamp. Moving now. The tech hesitated. The resident looked at her, this floor nurse with the command voice of someone who had no business giving commands. We need to wait for, he started, but Captain Moss's oxygen saturation was already dropping. 88, 82. 76, the monitor's rhythm became a flat scream in the silence. "He's crashing," Laura said, and moved to the bed. Her hands were already reaching for the equipment. "I will handle this." She didn't wait for permission. The thoracotomy tray clattered onto the sterile field. Someone had the sense to bring it, maybe muscle memory of their own, maybe just fear, and Laura found the blade in her hand like it had always been there. The 10 blade. Cold, sharp, familiar in a way that 3 years in San Diego could never take away. 23 years ago, she'd held this exact blade in a field hospital in Kandahar under the grinding percussion of small arms fire, steady hands while rounds sparked off the metal roof. Her hands had not forgotten. She marked the 5th intercostal space, mid-axillary line. The blade made a line across Captain Moss's chest, not tentative, not searching, but certain. The skin opened. Blood pooled immediately in the incision, and she widened it, muscle and rib exposed, the resident making a sound like someone had kicked him in the stomach. She reached into the chest cavity with the precision of someone operating on her own anatomy, and there, the pericardium, distended and dark with blood. One movement. The pericardium opened under her finger, and 200 milliliters of blood poured out like a pressure release, and suddenly the heart expanded, suddenly the monitor showed the rhythm it had been trying to produce all along. Laura's left hand found the heart. Her right hand moved to the satin sky clamp on the tray. She compressed the ventricle against the posterior chest wall, the manual compressions that no textbook taught, only experience, only muscle memory, only the knowledge that came from having done this when failure meant someone died on your hands in a dust storm in a compound that wasn't supposed to be there. The monitor ticked up. 60, 62. 65. Sinus rhythm. The heart was pumping blood on its own now, Laura's hand guiding it, steady as a surgical laser. "Manual compression, maintain perfusion," she said. "Get me 2 liters of O-negative running wide open. Type and cross for 6 units. Call OR, tell them we're coming hot with an open chest." The room moved like someone had flipped a switch from statues to urgency. The senior resident was already moving, already making calls. The attending surgeon pushed through the doors at exactly the moment Laura's fingers felt the heart settle into its rhythm, felt the pulse rise in the great vessels under her palm. She stepped back 1 step, just one, to give him room, and she watched his face go pale. "What the hell?" he started, and then he saw the thoracotomy. Saw it with the eyes of someone who had done this procedure maybe 5 times in his career, in controlled OR settings with backup and lights and all the infrastructure of modern medicine. Laura's incision was clean. The pericardium was open. The heart was compressed with a human hand that had done this same action countless times, and it was working. The man was alive because she had made a choice and executed it perfectly. "Cardiac tamponade from the original hemorrhage," Laura said, her voice returning to the soft register of a floor nurse. "Drained approximately 200 milliliters from the pericardium. Maintaining manual compression until you're ready to take over. Patient stabilizing. Sinus rhythm for the last 90 seconds. The attending moved to the bed without saying anything. He didn't ask her to step away. He moved beside her, his hands taking over the compression with the coordinated efficiency of muscle memory meeting muscle memory, and Laura released the heart and stepped backward, her hands falling to her sides, her breathing exactly as controlled as it had been before she'd made an incision through skin and muscle and opened a man's chest with her bare hands. She turned and walked out of the ICU at 0252. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was waiting outside the OR, watching through the observation window as the attending surgeon closed the chest and the surgical tech looked up at the gallery and whispered something to the scrubbed nurse, and whispered questions began to ripple through the staff like water from a stone. Where did she learn that? That's not nursing school technique. Did you see her hands? The confidence in every movement. The way she called the instruments without hesitation. The way she knew exactly where to compress. And then Ashford appeared beside the window, his face pale. Not red. Not angry. Something worse, calculation. Cold mathematics happening behind his eyes, probabilities shifting, his entire plan recalculating in real time. He looked at Laura's reflection in the glass, and she looked back at him, and neither of them spoke because they both knew that something fundamental had just broken. By 0600, her badge was deactivated. By 0630, security was walking her to her locker with the kind of neutral politeness that meant they had orders and they were following them. By 0700, she was folding her scrubs into a cardboard box, the same scrubs she'd worn for 3 years, the same blue cotton that had become her skin, and she was folding them with the same precision she'd once used to fold her uniform, each crease a military operation, each corner meeting at a perfect right angle. The laundry worker, an older man with a Vietnam veteran cap and eyes that had seen things, watched her from the sorting station. He waited until she was on her last pair, and then he crossed over and stood beside her at the folding table. He didn't say anything at first. Just stood there, watching her hands move. "Why is someone with your skills leaving?" he finally asked. Laura finished the fold. "Set the scrubs on the pile." She didn't answer because there wasn't an answer that fit in words. She just picked up the cardboard box and walked out of Sacred Heart Hospital at 0745 on a Tuesday morning with her entire career in a box that weighed less than a sandbag. The whispers started before she even left the operating room. They came from the surgical gallery, from the resident who'd frozen at the instrument tray, from the attending who'd arrived just as Laura's hands were releasing the patient's heart back to its own rhythm. She could hear them even through the surgical mask, even beneath the ventilator's mechanical breath and the monitor's steady climb from flatline to 82 beats per minute. Where did she learn that? That's not a standard ER procedure. I've only seen that done in. I've only read about that in. Laura peeled off her gloves with the same precision she'd used to thread a needle through cardiac tissue. She didn't turn around. She didn't acknowledge the voices. She simply walked to the sink, scrubbed her hands with antiseptic that smelled like hospitals and endings, and waited for what came next. What came next was Dr. Marcus Ashford standing outside the OR, his face the color of old bone. He wasn't angry. That was what made it worse. His rage would have been predictable, manageable. Instead, his expression held the pale calculation of a man watching his entire architecture collapse in real time. His eyes locked onto hers for exactly 3 seconds, and in that moment, Laura understood that he'd seen more than just her surgical skill. He'd seen the dog tag. He'd seen the classification codes etched into metal. He'd recognized what she was. He turned and walked away without speaking. Laura knew how this would end. She'd spent 3 years in hospitals learning to read the small signs, the way a patient's blood pressure dropped before they crashed, the way infection moved through a wound before fever showed on a thermometer. She could read the institutional body the same way. And right now, something vital was hemorrhaging inside Sacred Heart. The page came at 1,643 hours, Nurse Bennett to Human Resources. She took the elevator slowly. The fluorescent lights above flickered in a rhythm that sounded like Morse code, like a countdown. The 4th floor smelled like industrial carpet and fear. Patricia Chen, the HR director, sat behind her desk with a folder already open, and Laura knew, with the absolute certainty of someone who'd learned to read silence the way infantry read terrain, that Dr. Ashford had already walked through that door. Chen's voice was careful. Professional. "Laura, Dr. Ashford has filed several formal complaints regarding last night's incident in the ICU." Laura didn't sit. She stood with her hands clasped in front of her, the posture of a soldier at parade rest. "I saved a patient's life." "Yes. That's not in dispute." Chen's fingers moved across the keyboard, pulling up documents. "But the manner in which you performed an unauthorized surgical procedure outside your scope of practice raises serious questions about your credentials. Dr. Ashford is concerned that you may have misrepresented your background during your hiring process." The words hung in the air like shrapnel. "There's also mention of unauthorized possession of military identification," Chen continued, her voice dropping. "He found it concerning enough to escalate this past hospital administration directly to risk management. Laura, I need to know, is there something about your background that wasn't disclosed on your nursing application?" Laura's hands didn't tremble. Her jaw didn't clench. When she spoke, her voice was steady as operating room air. Everything on my application was accurate. The medical discharge paperwork. The spine injury. Accurate. Chen set down her pen. I believe you. But I need to tell you that by end of business today, you're being placed on administrative leave pending a formal credentialing review. Your badge access is being suspended as of 1800 hours. You'll need to turn in your identification and attend an exit interview with hospital security. Laura nodded once. She'd expected nothing less. By 06:47 the next morning, a security officer, young, nervous, trying not to meet her eyes, escorted her from the premises. She'd arrived at her locker to find it already sealed, witnessed by security. She'd opened it to retrieve the few items she kept there: a water bottle with no logo, a sweater from REI, and a photograph of her mother taken 30 years ago. The blue scrubs came later. The hospital laundry occupied a corner of the basement that smelled like bleach and industrial detergent. The machines hummed like sleeping giants. An older man with silver temples and the bearing of someone who'd worn dress blues was folding white hospital linens when Laura arrived with her bundle of scrubs. He looked up, and she watched recognition cross his face. Not of her face, of what she'd done. You're the one from ICU, he said. Not a question. Yes. He set down the towel he'd been folding and looked at her the way you'd look at someone walking into a fire. Why are you leaving? Laura ran the blue cotton through her hands, feeling the familiar weight of it. She folded it the way she'd folded her uniform 6 years ago, a perfect rectangle, all angles and precision, every crease a testimony to discipline. Because I was never supposed to save him, she said quietly. The man, his name tag read Rodriguez, T. didn't respond. He just watched her work, folding scrub after scrub with military exactness, each one a small death of the life she'd built. That evening, in a private hospital room on the 7th floor, Captain Richard Moss opened his eyes. The machines around him sang their electronic songs. Monitors displayed his heart's return to normal rhythm, his oxygen saturation climbing steadily into the 90s. His daughter Sarah stood beside him, naval intelligence credentials hanging from her neck, her hand on his shoulder. When his eyes focused, when he tried to speak and found his throat blocked by the endotracheal tube, she leaned close. You made it, Dad. You're alive. He blinked once. Twice. His fingers moved toward the breathing tube, but Sarah caught his hand gently. There's someone we need to find, she said. You kept saying something about a dog tag. A surgical procedure you recognize. A technique you've only seen combat medics use. She pulled out a small notebook. Tell me what you remember about the nurse who saved you. In the security office 2 floors below, the footage from 03:47 hours played again on a loop. A nurse in blue scrubs moving through the ICU like a ghost. Her hands working with the certainty of someone who'd done this before, many times, under circumstances that didn't involve sterile technique or blood banks or attending surgeons standing by. A single metal object slipping free from beneath her neckline, catching the light. Sarah Moss had spent 13 years in naval intelligence gathering pieces of classified information, assembling them into operational pictures. She didn't need much. She didn't need her father's full coherent account. She just needed that dog tag. She just needed the glimpse of a surgical technique that belonged in a battlefield, not in a San Diego hospital. She made one phone call to a contact at NCIS. That contact made another call. By midnight, a background check had been initiated that would pull Laura Bennett's file from the deepest reaches of the Pentagon, the file that had been sealed 9 years ago, the file marked with classifications that shouldn't exist in civilian hospitals, the file that contained the truth about Bagram, about the court-martial, about the 17 soldiers she'd saved on a night when everything was burning. Laura sat in her kitchen at 02:47 hours, unable to sleep, her discharge papers spread on the table in front of her. 3 years of careful construction, of becoming someone anonymous, someone safe, someone who could exist without history. And it had taken 48 minutes to destroy. She picked up the dog tag on its broken chain and held it to the kitchen light. The metal was cold. The classification codes were still visible if you knew how to read them. She had no idea that Captain Moss was awake. No idea that his daughter was making calls. No idea that across military networks, in briefing rooms and federal databases, people were beginning to ask questions about who had really saved a Navy captain in a San Diego hospital, and why someone would hide a combat medical expertise so completely that she'd spend 6 years as a floor nurse instead of using her skills where they belonged. The next chapter was already being written. It would arrive at her door in the form of a Marine in dress blues. It would arrive with words she wasn't ready to hear. It would arrive with the machinery of the federal government finally catching up to what she'd been running from all along. But tonight, in her kitchen, she simply held the dog tag and waited for morning. If you're watching this and you've ever felt invisible despite everything you've accomplished, like your skills didn't matter because you chose to be quiet about them, subscribe and let us know. Comment below if you think Laura should have ever revealed who she was. And if you believe that true power isn't a title but the ability to help others, hit that notification bell so you don't miss the final chapter of Major Laura Bennett's story.